This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news recorded at 14 hours GMT on Thursday, the 25th of January. This is Andrew Peach with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service News today. Coming up, President Trump is at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where he'll face criticism of his decision to impose tariffs on some imports. First up, a meeting with the British Prime Minister.
That special relationship between the UK and America is as strong as it ever has been. And what I want to be talking to the President about is a whole range of foreign policy areas where we have faced shared challenges and are working together.
Also in the podcast, Hindu hardliners opposed to the screening of a new Bollywood film have clashed with police in northern India. Those who've seen it aren't sure what all the fuss is about.
I didn't find anything controversial in the movie, and all the ruckus which is going on right now is uncalled for.
The European Union's highest court has ruled that an Austrian campaigner can sue Facebook over its use of personal data. And later, scientists in Switzerland have established the identity of a mummified woman. Turns out to be an ancestor of the British Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson.
The mysterious mummy was buried right in front of the altar, good clothes and rather plump. She was also riddled with mercury, a common treatment for syphilis in the 18th century.
First, President Trump is in the Swiss resort town of Davos to attend the World Economic Forum, the first US leader to do so since Bill Clinton 18 years ago. Mr. Trump has said he'll tell the world how great America is doing and then seek investment in the United States. His speech on Friday will be keenly watched around the world as US trade policies come under scrutiny. The French president and the German chancellor have already been warning of the dangers of nationalism, populism and protectionism. As we record this podcast, Mr. Trump is having his first bilateral meeting with the British Prime Minister Theresa May. She told our economics editor Kamal Ahmed what's on the agenda.
That special relationship between the UK and America is as strong as it ever has been. And what I want to be talking to the President about is a whole range of foreign policy areas, whether it's working together in relation to North Korea, or whether it's working together in Syria and Iraq. We work with the United States on all of these issues and we'll be continuing to do so.
Free trade as well, possibly?
We're very keen that we'll be able to do that. Free trade agreement when we leave the European Union with the United States of America. They're keen on that, we're keen on that, and we're already working on how we can shape that.
I asked our business reporter Theo Leggett what type of reception Mr. Trump is likely to get in Davos.
Theresa May well be very pleased to see him, but other leaders may give him a much frostier reception. There's been talk, in fact, of some walking out during his speech, and that's because many of them will feel that he denigrated them with his very colourful, well-reported remarks about certain countries. He'll probably be quite happy with that, though. He hasn't come to Davos to have a few meetings behind closed doors and then slope off for an afternoon skiing. He's come to the World Economic Forum in order to make an impact and to explain how his policy of America first, as he sees it, is going to dominate going forward.
Is he there to take them on? Is that the point of going, rather than to cosy up to the other world leaders, to position himself in a rather different place?
I don't think there's any cosying up going to be going on, but he will want to make contact with other global leaders and make constructive contact with them. One of his associates said earlier this week that America first does not mean America alone. And the United States has been pushing this idea that it isn't a protectionist nation. What it's doing is merely exerting its rights in global trade. So other countries, as far as the US sees it, have been bending the rules, have been treating American companies unfairly, have been unfairly subsidising their own industries. And as far as the US is concerned, that has to stop. That said, his message is very much at odds with other leaders, such as Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron, suggesting that nationalism is the wrong way to go and that protectionism is the wrong way to go.
The mission statement for this year's World Economic Forum is creating a shared future in a fractured world. Not sure whether that means much, really. Does anything tangible really come out of these things?
I think my colleague Joe Miller has been explaining on the BBC website a little bit more about the jargon you associate with Davos. There are arguments about whether or not meetings like this actually do achieve anything. There's certainly a lot of grandstanding, but don't forget, behind closed doors, people can get together all in one place and they can do business.
Theo Leggett reporting. Now, many people will be vying for the attention of Donald Trump during his 24 hours in Switzerland. So we asked some of the Davos delegates what they would say if they got 2 minutes with him. First of all, the former Norwegian Foreign Minister Espen Barth Eide.
First, I would say welcome, and it's great that he comes here because a lot of people want to hear what he thinks and discuss with him. And then I would say that most of us here, I think almost all of us, believe that a complex world needs common solutions. We need norms and institutions and a shared purpose. And the opposite of America first is not America last, but rather an America that thrives in good international cooperation.
I'm Roland Rudd. I'm chairman of Finsbury, a global communications group. I'd say, President Trump, are you not concerned that by coarsening and vulgarizing the debate and personalizing it in a way that calls people out, which leads to personal attacks, not just in the press, but actually physically, that you're creating a maelstrom of discontent and unhappiness, which in itself can endanger a democratic country and our ideals of human rights and democracy?
I'm Jacob Wallenberg. I'm the chairman of a Swedish investment company called Investor AB. If I met President Trump in a corridor, I would tell him two things. I would say, one, the United States has a very important point of responsibility in the world, being the leading light, as they have been since the Second World War. Secondly, in that vein, I would say that free trade is something, and globalization is something that the world needs. I truly believe in that, and I would urge him to develop his thoughts on the trade agenda.
More secure world means less imbalanced world, and to be more secure we have to demonopolize energy supplies and bring stability into some destabilized regions like the Middle East or Ukraine. So I would welcome American presence in those areas.
Mateusz Morawiecki, the Prime Minister of Poland, adding that selection of thoughts from people at the World Economic Forum in Davos on what they'd like to say to Donald Trump. Syria has described the US decision to keep its troops in the country for an indefinite period as a hostile act. The Americans say the move announced last week is aimed at fighting the Islamic State group in Syria. The Syrian Deputy Foreign Minister Faisal Mekdad has told the BBC it was a devastating mistake. Mr Mekdad's comment came ahead of a new round of UN-led peace talks starting in Vienna. In Damascus, our chief international correspondent Lise Doucette spoke to him and asked him about the US policy.
Another mistake, the devastating mistake by the new administration in the United States, which contradicts, with all electoral promises. There is nothing now of what Donald Trump has promised his people in all fields. 100% different agenda.
Is this a new stage in the Syrian conflict where you have the Americans talking about a long-term presence, you have Turkish troops which have just gone in across your northern border?
This is a very serious issue. Long-term presence of the American troops on Syrian soil will be considered as an aggression against the sovereignty of Syria, will be considered a violation of the United Nations Security Council resolution.
But what can you do about it?
Which always speak about the unity and territorial integrity of the Syrian people and their country. What we are going to do is a different issue. But when you consider such a presence as hostile, as aggressive, as against the territorial unity of a country, then a lot of issues and options are open before the Syrian people and their government to act.
And Turkey invasion?
The Turkish invasion is open violation of the sovereignty of Syria. It is an aggression against the sovereignty of Syria. And Syria
said that Russia gave the green light for that.
We don't know. We know what the Russians are thinking. We don't think Russia can act on behalf of the Syrian government or against the principles Russia has always defended in Syria. So it is a Turkish aggression against the sovereignty of Syria, and Syria has every right to answer such an aggression.
Are you going to respond militarily?
We are responding.
How?
Whether directly or indirectly.
How?
Our way.
Which is?
You can watch what's happening now. So we have our own policy, we have our own, position. We have condemned this aggression, and we shall act accordingly.
Such as you shoot down the planes?
I will not specify any action, but Syria has the right to defend itself. And we have said once and again that we shall use all possible means to answer the attacks of the Turkish regime.
Including shooting down planes?
We said this very openly. We said our air defenses are ready.
The Syrian Deputy Foreign Minister Faisal Mekdad with Lise Doucette in Damascus. Thousands of police in riot gear have been deployed outside cinemas in parts of India after threats of violence from Hindu hardliners opposed to the release of a controversial Bollywood film. Protesters clashed with police and ransacked shops in states of Uttarakhand and Rajasthan. Schools were shut in one suburb of Delhi after demonstrators threw stones and smashed the windows of a school bus. Despite the threats, though, the Bollywood epic Padmavat still opened in 5,000 cinemas, telling the story of a 14th century Hindu queen and a Muslim ruler. The BBC's Pratiksha Gildar is outside a cinema in South Delhi.
It's a big budget film made by a very famous filmmaker, starring three of India's biggest Bollywood stars. So there was, in any case, going to be a lot of anticipation around it. But I met cinema goers this morning and they came to see what the fuss is all about. Is there anything actually controversial in the film? And most of them seem to think the film is absolutely fine, and it actually reflects the Hindu Rajput community who are staging the protests in a very good manner and in a very respectable manner. So yes, a lot of anticipation. The film has opened today and people have been queuing up, although some cinemas have decided not to screen the film for security reasons.
So the controversy has generated publicity, which has generated interest, so a lot of people will be going to see the film. For those movie houses that are putting it on, is there extra security, that kind of thing?
There absolutely is, Andrew, and it's quite extraordinary to see anti-riot police deployed outside of cinema halls. We are in south of Delhi, outside a theatre, and I can see heavy security presence because, there were fears of widespread violence again today. The last few days have been particularly violent across the country, not just in and around Delhi. There have been some sporadic cases of violence in North and West India this morning, but nothing too serious so far.
And just put into context for us why it's seen as controversial, not among the people who you've spoken to who've seen it today, but among other people who've been raising these concerns about it. What's the problem?
The real issue here is how some Hindu caste groups, especially the Hindu Rajput group, they feel that a historical figure from their community, Queen Padmavati, who's the main character of this film, has been portrayed inappropriately because they think that the film portrays an inappropriate relationship between her and a medieval 14th century Muslim ruler. Filmmakers have denied it many times that there is no objectionable scene that would seem disrespectful towards the Queen, and that is a big debate here in India, creative freedom. This film is just a latest example. I'm an Indian and I don't have any qualms in saying that Indians are very easily outraged over their portrayal in a certain manner, which sometimes actually is farcical.
Pratiksha Gildar with me from Delhi. This is Global News. The mountains of southwestern Sichuan province in China are home to one of the world's largest Tibetan Buddhist monasteries. But human rights campaigners say the Chinese authorities have now imposed strict controls there. Our Asia Pacific regional editor Michael Bristow told me more.
Well, this monastery, Larungar, is in Sichuan province, a Tibetan area of Sichuan. And a couple of years ago, the Chinese authorities essentially bulldozed a lot of the dwellings which had built up around this monastery. They said, the Chinese at the time, that they wanted to reduce the population of the monastery. Human Rights Watch has now got hold of a document, which appears to be an official document, detailing the control over this monastery that they want to impose, the Chinese authorities. This is control over the management of it, its finances, who's allowed to go study there, what teaching materials. They have essentially complete control by the Communist Party over what goes on at this monastery.
Why do the Chinese authorities care so much?
Well, this monastery was only founded in about 1980, but it quickly grew. Amazing sight. If you see the photographs of it, buildings sprung up across these bare hillsides surrounding this monastery. And the authorities, like they do all across China with all kinds of things, they fear any kinds of organisation or any kind of movement, particularly religious movements, which gain traction. They think that people might join that and then eventually start complaining about the Communist Party. 20 years ago, they tried to reduce the population of this monastery. They didn't succeed. This time they have. They've reduced the population to about 5,000 monks and nuns. And also now they're keeping a closer watch on what goes on there.
And do you think the attention of the Chinese authorities, as much as these specific measures will have the desired effect from their point of view and stop people wanting to go and join it?
Well, they won't necessarily want people to stop going to join this monastery or, in fact, listen to the teachings transmitted by the monks. But what they can do is that they can control and tightly control everything which goes on in the monastery. As I said, they fear that things get out of hand, that things become political. They're also trying to restrict people coming to the monastery from outside the area, only letting people in who are from this particular area in Sichuan province.
Our Asia-Pacific regional editor, Michael Bristow. You're listening to Global News with the most important stories and the best interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. Don't forget, every weekend you can hear a review of the week's main stories and why they matter. That's in our programme, The World This Week, which is broadcast on Saturdays and Sundays and available to download from our website at bbc.com/programmes. Now to Israel, where there have been large protests against a new scheme to force thousands of African migrants out of the country. This is a government programme and it offers the following choice if an application for asylum fails. Either a $3,500 payment and a plane ticket home to be used by the end of March, or face arrest. The UN wants the scheme scrapped. Our Middle East correspondent Yolan Nell is in Tel Aviv.
On Neve Sha'anan Street in South Tel Aviv, you don't find Israeli shops. Instead, there are Eritrean and Sudanese restaurants, greengrocers, hairdressers, cheap clothes stores, all run by African migrants. Most arrived 5 to 10 years ago. Teklit Michael left Eritrea a decade ago, aged 18.
I left my country because there is no right for human being in general. I had no right, I was imprisoned, I was forcibly drafted to the army, so I chose to come to Israel and seek asylum.
But here the Israeli authorities see Teklit as an infiltrator or economic migrant, and they're giving thousands of young single men like him a choice. Take a lump cash sum of $3,500 and leave by the end of March, heading to a third country, Uganda or Rwanda, or face jail.
Personally, I choose to be in prison than to go to Uganda or Rwanda. So I chose to stay here until something is changing in my country to return back to my home.
Already Israel has rounded up many migrants, retroactively applying rules demanding they spend time in this detention centre in the Negev desert. More recent arrivals are here too, but a new security fence along the border with Egypt has helped stop the influx of people. Now attention is turning to South Tel Aviv. The mission is to return the neighbourhood to the citizens of Israel, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told residents on a recent visit. They cheered. But this part of the city has seen demonstrations for and against the deportation plan, resulting in scuffles between the rival groups. In Israel's parliament, the Knesset, there have been heated debates. Some politicians see the would-be asylum seekers as a threat to Israel's social fabric and Jewish character. Jonathan Jacobowitz is from the Israel Immigration Policy Center, which lobbied for tough new measures.
There is definitely that point of view that Israel is concerned about preserving its character as a Jewish state and its Jewish majority. And it's also a social problem. When you have people who have a problem connecting to the Jewish majority, they might be sidelined, and next generations can also develop into a social problem.
Others argue that in a nation founded by Jewish refugees for Jewish refugees, there should be more sympathy for the Africans now seeking refuge. Reut Michaeli, director of the Hotline for Refugees and Migrants, shares this view.
We have moral obligation, not only legal obligation, to treat these people with care. And the asylum system in Israel is simply not functioning. The refugee recognition rate is lower than 1% in Israel. If you look around the world, most of the Eritreans receive asylum. Same goes to Sudanese. Over 60% of Sudanese around the world are recognized as refugees.
But already, some in Israel have begun receiving documents, instructing them to decide whether they take a flight or go to prison.
Yolan Nell reporting from Tel Aviv. The European Court of Justice has backed the right of an Austrian privacy campaigner, Max Schrems, to sue Facebook in an Austrian court over its use of personal data. The story from Vienna and our correspondent Bethany Bell.
Max Schrems alleges Facebook has illegally violated the privacy rights of European users. Facebook rejects the charges and says it's always complied with EU data protection laws. A spokeswoman for Facebook said the ruling supported previous court decisions that Mr. Schrems' claims couldn't proceed as class actions on behalf of other consumers. Mr. Schrems says the ruling was a huge blow for Facebook, as his individual lawsuit against the company could go ahead. He said Facebook would have to explain whether its business model was in line with stringent European privacy laws.
Every year, yellow fever kills tens of thousands of people. In a bid to prevent this mosquito-borne disease, a mass vaccination campaign is getting underway in two of the world's most populous countries. First to Nigeria, where there have been hundreds of cases. Tarek Isarovich is from the World Health Organization.
Nigeria is one of the 47 countries where yellow fever is endemic disease. Last time they had outbreak was in 2002. Now, late last year, there were cases reported from a number of states in Nigeria. It started in August, and by January this year, there were more than 350 suspected cases from 16 states. This means that there is a risk that the virus is being spread to other states in Nigeria. The vaccine is being around for a number of years. The target is really to have 90% of people in one community to be vaccinated to prevent outbreaks. We are obviously not there, and therefore the national health authorities plan to vaccinate more than 25 million people this year in an overall plan to try to really eliminate yellow fever epidemics, because we cannot eradicate the virus, but we can prevent the epidemics from happening. The full dose is providing lifelong protection to an individual, and this full dose will be used in Nigeria.
Meantime, in Brazil, the vaccination campaign is in response to yellow fever spreading to new parts of the country. Julia Carneiro is in Rio de Janeiro.
The vaccination campaign was due to start in 2 weeks' time, but has been brought forward because of a growing surge of yellow fever. 53 people have died from the disease since July last year, and recent cases in rural areas have spread panic. There has been a rush to health centers, with queues starting in the middle of the night and people waiting up to 15 hours to get the vaccine. Last week, the World Health Organization included the whole state of São Paulo in the yellow fever risk area because of the intense presence of the virus in what is Brazil's wealthiest region. The geographical spread of the disease has sparked fear of an urban epidemic, something Brazil hasn't seen since 1942. The campaign will administer vaccines in fractional doses in order to reach more people, but this means the doses will be less powerful and will last for 4 years rather than for life.
Julia Carneiro in Rio. Now to Norway, where retreating glaciers have uncovered a myriad of treasures, some finds going back as far as 4000 BC. Climate change has increased the pace of the ice melt, and the team at the Glacier Archaeology Programme at Oppland in Norway have found more than 2,000 objects so far. Alan Kasuja spoke to Lars Pilo, co-director of the programme.
As you said, we found more than 2,000 artifacts melting out of the ice. Among these artifacts, there are things that are related to hunting, like arrows. We found nearly 200 of those, some of them dating back to 6,000 years. And we found a lot of also clothing items dating back millennia. And we have remains of skis, of sleds, and of dead pack horses as well.
And what condition are they in?
Well, if we're lucky and they melt out for the first time, they are in a pristine condition. They look like they were lost yesterday. You know, the ice acts like a sort of gigantic prehistoric deep freezer, preserving them just as they were.
Right. And is there something that you found that has excited you more than everything else?
I think perhaps one of the most exciting finds was when we found a tunic, a man's clothing item, that dates back 1,700 years. That's a fantastic find. It's unique. But what happened afterwards was that we found out that it belonged to a site where there were hundreds of finds which were in a glaciated mountain pass at nearly 2,000 meters.
Lars Pilo from the Glacier Archaeology Programme at Oppland in Norway. And staying with discoveries, scientists in Switzerland have established the identity of a mummified woman found more than 4 decades ago. She turns out to be an ancestor of the British Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson. The body was discovered by workmen renovating a church in 1975, but could only be identified using more modern DNA testing. Imogen Folks has the story.
The mysterious mummy was buried right in front of the altar. Good clothes and rather plump, a well-fed and well-to-do lady. She was also riddled with mercury, a common treatment for syphilis in the 18th century. Historians long suspected she was a member of Basel's wealthy Bischoff family, but only in the last few months, by extracting DNA from the mummy's big toe and comparing it with DNA from living descendants of the Bischoffs, could scientists be sure this was indeed Anna Katharina Bischoff. From there, more descendants could be traced. Anna Katharina's daughter married one Hubert, Baron Pfeffel. A direct line 6 generations later arrives at Britain's Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson. To borrow one of his favourite phrases, Anna Katharina apparently lived a life of blameless domesticity. The wife of a church minister, she probably contracted syphilis while caring for patients with the disease. The mercury treatment she undertook eventually killed her and preserved her body.
Imogen Folks in Switzerland. And that's it from us for now, but an updated version of Global News will be available to download later. Just before we go, we'd like to tell you that we'll be in Washington next week for President Trump's first State of the Union address. So do download the Global Podcasts day by day for coverage of that. We'll be doing a special one for you. Look out for it. If you're in Washington and you'd like to take part, then do drop us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. My name's Andrew Peach. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.